Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for this opportunity. I'd like the panelists to step up here. We have just an hour, so this is going to be very much different from yesterday in the sense that I will issue some decrees. There will be no questions from the floor. And first of all, I will issue a presidential decree to prohibit any use of acronyms for the next hour. No acronyms on stage. And that goes for Alexander Shestakov as well. Please take a seat in Ms. Pocket right there in the middle. Alex, why are you over there? And Dali is on her way. I saw her a second ago. She's right there. What we're going to do at this junction, where you have been fed scientific details to a very great extent, and try to, say, put all of this into a midway perspective, midway in the sense that we're sort of halfway through the Congress here, and look at the biggest possible picture. There are some key words that we have to address with this panel. The UN, there was an abbreviation, sorry. The United Nations Aichi biodiversity targets, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how does the global community work together across borders, disciplines, and barriers to shape the post-2020 global agenda. That is, to say the least, a tall order that we will have to deal with within the scope of less than an hour. So thank you very much for agreeing to this quite daunting task. And let me introduce to you the panel just from this end. Hannele Pokka is the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Environment here in Finland. So in a sense, she also represents the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. You may also want to know that Hannele Pokka is the former governor of this province, the province of Lapland, and the former Minister of Justice of Finland. And actually, Rovaniemi is, I believe, your hometown. Yes. So thank you for also having us here. Then you have already met Dali Doro yesterday, chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, elected, I believe, in June this year? Yeah.
July.
July. Congratulations. And Dali also sits on the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And then to the conventions, Martha Rojas is the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, based in Switzerland, former director of the National Parks in Colombia, and for many, many years, 25 years involved in international works, and now, as I said, Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on the Wetlands. And right there on the very far end of the panel, Melanie Virtue, head of the Aquatic Species team of the Convention on Migratory Species of Wild Animals, based in Germany. And finally, Alexander Shestakov, head of Division for Scientific and Policy Support at the headquarters of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And many of you will know Alex as the former head of the WWF Arctic program. So a very competent, very global panel, I would say. Alex, could you help us, first of all, understand, to get us sort of on a common platform here, why is there suddenly such a focus on year 2020? What is the pivotal information we need to understand that?
Thank you, Martin, and thanks for this opportunity being here. And by the way, starting from today, the name of my division is different.
I see.
It's not policy and science anymore. It's science, society, and sustainable futures, in plural. So why 2020? Several reasons, and definitely for the Convention on Biological Diversity, it will be a very big year. It was back to 2010 in Nagoya in Japan. 196 parties to the convention adopted so-called strategic plan for the convention and 20 Aichi targets, which actually covers very different areas of biodiversity, and the period for those targets was 2011-2020. So that's why for us, 2020 is really important year because we need to deliver, and when I say we, that's mean first of all 196 countries. It's not the Secretariat of the Convention. Secretariat is there to help. Another point why 2020. Because in 2020 we will adopt the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which probably will get the name Beijing Targets, as actually the COP conference of the parties to the convention. The 15th meeting will happen in October 2020 in Beijing, in China. And then there is a third element that if you look at Sustainable Development Goals, and especially life on land, goal 15, you will see that number of targets were actually copy-paste from CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity Strategic Plan. And many of them have the same deadline, 2020. So that's why that's probably will be first targets from the Sustainable Development Goal framework to be really fully assessed in terms of achievement in 2020. So that's why, again, let's make our assessment of achievements, but also looking forward. So that's why for us, definitely 2020 will be a very substantial year, as well as many, many other events will happen in 2020 if you look at it, including potentially what we are asking for is actually the global summit of heads of states on biodiversity the same year.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that's very important to establish this kind of knowledge also for the people who are attending this Congress, because, of course, all of their work will actually feed into this process. And I know that, Melanie Virtue, you are very concerned, or at least engaged in this process with your convention, of course. And yours, like the one that Sasha's working on. And thank you also, Sasha, for reminding us that it's not the secretariats that have to make the decisions, it's actually the government. So there's a conduit from the science to the secretariats, but in the end, you have to feed it to the government and convince them to do something, Melanie. So good luck with that. How does the Arctic feed into your work?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, actually sitting here these last 2 days listening to all the fantastic scientific presentations we've had, I keep thinking, you know, migratory species really are the thing that connects the Arctic with the rest of the world. And, you know, this morning we were in, I'm not allowed to use the acronym, Arctic Migratory Bird Initiative session, and we were talking about, you know, the three major flyways, you know, and well, I'm from New Zealand, so, you know, the East Asian flyways, you know, ends in New Zealand, and the Godwits, you know, who spend the summers, you know, in Arctic Siberia, in Alaska, Siberia, and you would think of them as Arctic migratory birds, but we think of them as New Zealand birds.
Well, they aren't.
They are. They're very important in New Zealand, and, you know, we have a big celebration when they return each year from wherever they've been. They come back, and that's the important thing, but they only come back if every place on the way that these and the other birds, the red knots, etc., you know, the staging ground, you know, especially for the East Asian flyway, you know, up through East Asia, you know, there's so many problems, you know, up the way, and if the birds aren't fed on the way, as we know, you know, they're not going to make it back to the Arctic, but they're also not going to make it to New Zealand. And so, I mean, this is why CMS exists, basically to bring countries together so that we can be sure that our migratory animals are going to make it back next summer.
But you're pointing at the very problem. I mean, you call the bird New Zealand, a New Zealand bird, and we call it an Arctic bird. The governments on the road, on the flyways, do they connect to this global line of thinking that you are introducing?
They do, and I mean, I'm just being a bit nationalistic just for a moment because I'm from the south and there aren't enough of us here today. But yes, of course. I mean, so the governments really see that if there's any weak link in the chain, then we all lose, and so that we all have to, you know, pull our resources together. And, you know, through CMS, countries engage, you know, even when it's a species that isn't even in their country. They still say, no, but this is a global resource and this is globally important for all of us. So this is why we're here.
Yeah. And, Ms. Rojas, same question basically. The Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. What role does the Arctic play when you have to convince governments to do something?
I would say that we don't need to convince the governments. Actually, it's the governments who decide what needs to be done collectively when they deal with this type of issues. In the context of the Convention on Wetlands, so that everybody is on the same page, it's the oldest convention and it's focused on a particular ecosystem. So it's these ecosystems that have water. And it can be inland waters, fresh water, but also marine and coastal. So to give you a baseline, what we are seeing in the convention is that wetlands are disappearing faster than any other ecosystem, 3 times faster than forests. 3 times faster than forests. We just issued the first global outlook. And at the same time, it's the most valuable ecosystem when you look at the services. So if we look, for example, at water, protection against floods and droughts, if we look at food security, all these come from wetlands. So the context in which we are seeing the Arctic is that 60% of the Arctic is wetlands, but we are not giving sufficient attention. And if we look at, again, the Arctic in the global context, at least 50% of the whole wetlands of the world are here. So a main message is the importance of this ecosystem and how can it be seen in the context of all the values that it provides. So this is where the birds, migrating that my colleague here is involved in conserving, this is where they breed. So these are the places that are very important for biodiversity. They are very important for livelihoods, indigenous peoples, for fisheries. It's very important in terms of climate change because they store more carbon than all the other ecosystems. So the main message here is the Arctic wetlands are very important. We need to pay attention. Contracting parties of the convention are working towards that, and there is a connection between the Arctic and the globe because of the impacts and the solutions that they can provide. And so just to tell you, to give, again, like the context, is the convention has 170 contracting parties, and when they sign the convention, they commit to establishing areas of international importance, which are called Ramsar sites. And we have 80 in the Arctic. The 8 countries of the Arctic Council are contracting parties of the convention. And they also importantly commit to conserving all the wetlands. And finally, to cooperate. So this is what the convention does. And this region is extremely important for the countries, but also for the whole planet.
Yes. And thank you for some very interesting perspectives and some figures there that were quite astounding. 50% of the wetlands are in the Arctic. That, of course, puts a lot of obligations on the governments in the Arctic, but it also calls for, let's say, recognition at least from all the other countries. There are only 8. Some of them are very big, I realize that, but there are only 8 Arctic countries. And you say how many contracting parties? 170 some?
170.
Do all the 160-some countries recognize these figures from the Arctic? Do they realize that 50% of the wetlands we're talking about are in the Arctic?
Well, this is precisely what is not so known. It needs to be known. But interestingly, the convention is having its conference of the parties, which is where all the parties come together in 10 days. So I'm very busy. And one of the resolutions that contracting parties are going to be looking into is polar and subpolar wetlands, with the idea of bringing more attention to these important ecosystems. And there is a lot happening also, and I can, during our conversation, share more of what is being done in the Arctic Council and collaborating also with the Ramsar Convention. But yes, I think that the point that you made is very important. The world is not knowing the importance of the Arctic wetlands for, from a planetary scale.
And this brings me, of course, to you, Dali, that you know very well the issue of bringing the Arctic or bringing the world's attention to the Arctic. This is a daunting task that you've been working on for many years. Can you tell us, if we turn the tables here just for a second and say, what what do you imagine the Arctic peoples, the indigenous peoples, can contribute to the processes we're talking about here towards 2020?
Well, I think that one of the key things, and the comments that have been made so far just about the commitments of governments, the number of contracting parties, and your question about whether or not they realize the various different factors and elements that are presented within the Arctic and how they interrelate with their various different commitments. It's astonishing to me that they're the ones that, in fact, decide the commitments, enter into the agreements and the conventions, yet may not be fully cognizant of what all of this entails. And on the part of Indigenous peoples and or at least what I attempted to articulate during the keynote presentation, was the role and the place and the status of Indigenous peoples in relation to all of these various different international instruments. If you think about the relevant commitments of governments, too often what we have found is that they don't necessarily drill into what those commitments actually mean in the context of the Arctic, whether they're Arctic states or non-Arctic states, but significantly their connection to Indigenous peoples and the place and the status of Indigenous peoples in terms of biodiversity, in terms of their relationship to the environment, their reliance for purposes of food security, and a wide range of other things. So one of the key efforts and quite a lot of our time is spent on advocating to ensure that states are cognizant of their actual legally binding commitments in relation to the Arctic and significantly to Indigenous peoples.
And you were very forceful in stating the reasons for that particular work that you're doing, and you're pursuing that very efficiently. But my question was really, can you tell us how your community, how the Indigenous peoples can possibly contribute more, basically, than they're already doing to the efforts of the secretariats that will turn into, hopefully, decisions and new targets for the future?
Okay. I think one of the key ways is to take the Indigenous world perspective and specifically Indigenous knowledge into the realm of discussion about Arctic biodiversity, as well as our perspectives in relation to meeting a number of these targets, and how Indigenous peoples can contribute to resolving and achieving the targets that have been set.
Is there a specific lesson to be learned, or the Indigenous peoples, through the representations that they've had for years, despite all the mishaps and the shortcomings, is there a lesson that the rest of the world can learn in this respect from the Arctic?
Well, I think there are probably a number of different models that can be pointed to as far as engagement of Indigenous peoples through the work of the CAF working group, through the work of the Arctic Council. We just had a brief discussion about the models, or models that could potentially, innovative governance models that could be shared with Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. So, you know, to some extent, maybe this is useful and constructive in terms of what Indigenous peoples can contribute to the dialogue.
I'll be excited to hear what the people from the Secretariat say about that. I know some of the problems that the scientists think there is involved in this with Indigenous knowledge and how to incorporate it. It's not done in an afternoon, which is why there are sessions on it at this conference. Ms. Pocker, let's turn to you. We're in your hometown. I heard your president yesterday, I think I quoted him yesterday, I was very fond of that statement. The president said that climate change may not be the best conversation starter in all the Arctic capitals. We can all contemplate what he may have possibly thought of. Let's leave it at that for the moment, but simply say, what then? if climate change is not the conversation starter in all the Arctic capitals. We need to work together. I think that is a clear message if we have to solve just some of the issues on the table. What then is the constructive, forward slanting platform that we can get people together on?
Yeah, thank you for for invitation to this panel discussion, but don't take this sentence from President's speech out of the whole combination. We both know what he meant, but don't let it disturb us. But if we take all these conventions which are now mentioned here, so SDGs under the United Nations, SDP, legally binding convention, Ramsar, and what was told by the indigenous peoples, I raise up that everything what happens here in the Arctic must be sustainable. Whatever you are doing here, if you are doing business, if you are living by traditional ways, or you are protecting, everything must be sustainable. And I think that is the big message from all these conventions, which have quite a lot of similarities. And if I look Lapland, which is my old home region, of course this pressure comes from climate change, which changes many things here. And I don't say that this traditional know-how, what our Sami people can give this discussion is not bad. It's very important. But this is one pressure. But the other pressure comes that there is quite a lot interest towards how to use sustainable or not sustainably this region. So there is forestry, there is tourism, there is reindeer management, there is mining, and everybody wants to do something, how to do it sustainable, and this is one very actual discussion here going on.
Yes. So I also hear you say what brings people together is not only the fear of the consequences of climate change, is also a desire to continue living in a region that is affected by climate change in a prosperous way.
Because of course, we must think about young people and what kind of possibilities they have to go to school, to get the education and get jobs also here in Arctic territories.
Mm-hmm. Melanie, you're concerned with migratory species. What will bring people together? What is the common cause that are uniting people today?
I think, I mean, again, speaking on a global perspective, I think people also realize that the species in the Arctic and migratory species, the species that we deal with, have so many different roles to play. You know, there's very often an economic advantage to having your migratory species, you know, returning each year to your area or living there. I mean, I also work, for example, with turtles and sharks, and you know, there's tremendous amount of tourist potential for these species. And certainly in CBS, we find parties are not only focusing very narrowly on things, they're also looking at the broader perspectives of what migratory species do for economies, what they do for many different people, how they're used in industry, when they can be sustainably used. And that's certainly something that with the Secretariat we're promoting. We work a lot with on tourism, making tourism more sustainable, developing guidelines for whale watching, for boat-based watching, a variety of species. And I think parties really find, governments really find this useful to be able to find ways that they can make their economies stronger, while at the same time preserving species.
Does this put an additional, say, task, pressure on science? Do they need to focus otherwise, since people want to make money out of these animals?
Well, I think scientists are already working very hard on this issue because we all know that there's an economic imperative, if they don't pay, they don't stay kind of thing. And so the scientists that we've been dealing with, I find have always had one eye out for, how is it that species can be, and their ecosystems, can be economically advantageous to the country.
But it's not part of the biology studies at universities, for instance, or is it?
I think these days it is actually. This is sustainable development. This is the SDGs. This is, when you talk about sustainability, it's how do all the different aspects of the ecosystem, add up, and is there a role here, for conservation to be contributing to economies?
And thank you for bringing up the SDGs, which is also on our task today. We have to somehow help ourselves understand how they function. Alexander, help us. The SDGs, of course, is the United Nations, the entire world's attempt of creating a platform that can unite for action. I have come to a point where I often wonder, do they create additional action, or are they more often used as a description of what people already do?
No, it's both, Martin, definitely. Because a lot of stuff under SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, you don't want us to use acronyms.
Thank you.
By the way, so already going, but at the same time, there are a lot of new ambitions there. So what I believe is important when we are discussing those goals, there are several points. So the one, it's actually a voluntary framework, while our conventions are legally binding instruments. So this framework allows parties to be extremely flexible. And although our conventions also allow for flexibility, there are certain elements which are, again, legally binding. So probably our conventions are actually instruments, how you operationalize some elements of this global development framework. So another point, if we discuss biodiversity, biodiversity is not about goal 15, and even not about goal 14, with a strange name, life underwater, so I don't know what's inside the water. But it's actually going through all 17 goals, because biodiversity, in a way, is a main ground where achievement of all other goals is impossible if the biodiversity part is not done right way. And that's what the message need to be brought actually to policymakers and decision makers. There is also another component. So SDG,
the Sustainable Development Goals.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
Supposed to have, of course, assessment in terms of achievement. And there is pretty interesting mechanism of reporting, including incorporating elements of indicators for Sustainable Development Goals into national statistics. And that's an interesting avenue for us, for biodiversity community, because very little of biodiversity is currently in the national statistics, and national statistical offices do not pay attention. So maybe it's also the way for us, for biodiversity community, to work together with the Sustainable Development Goals community to ensure that our indicators are considered as part of reporting process in achieving Sustainable Development Goals. That actually national reports under all our conventions are linked and used for this reporting process. And for the moment, it's not. Most of people working from foreign affairs or economic development ministries on Sustainable Development Goals, they even have no idea that their own countries are reporting on certain elements of Sustainable Development Goals through the national reports on our conventions, for example. That doesn't exist for them. So that's actually need to be brought to their attention as well.
Yeah. So a lot of things can be done if governments decide and are told, informed that they have these options. I'd still like to ask you, Ms. Rojas, some years ago, we talked a lot about greenwashing. Companies, states would tell us what they would do and how green they were, and they would continue on doing basically what they were always doing. Aren't we looking at SDG washing now, to a certain degree? Sorry, Sustainable Development Goal washing.
Thank you.
Ms. Rojas.
Well, I think that this links also to the question that you asked just before, because in my view, the Sustainable Development Agenda was transformational. I mean, for all of us who have been many years since Rio, working on sustainability for many years, sustainable development was a matter of environmental ministries. So you would go to the Commission on Sustainable Development into New York, and you had the environment people speaking to each other about sustainable development. What the SDGs did is to bring sustainability within all the aspects of development as a framework, and you see that all the governments are developing SDG plans, sustainable development plans, that conventions are engaging in sustainable development plans, and the private sector is also engaging in sustainable development plans. And what is very interesting is that the private sector, and I don't want to generalize because you have all kinds, of different ways of being a private sector actor, but many are really getting sustainability not as a side activity, of corporate social responsibility, but as part of their operations, because they are asked now by the constituents to show that they are sustainable. And this may be carbon neutrality or sustainability of water use. So I think that in this regard, it is transformational. Now, we are not there, but I think that it's a framework that is important and amazing, really, in terms of providing a new way of thinking development.
I'd like, it's your turn, but I'd like you, if you want, to give us a comment in a minute or two on this particular interpretation of the SDGs. How are we to understand their transformational value? But it's your turn.
Well, no, I just wanted to add on to that it's not only those within environment. We're seeing a response from all the various different UN agencies and organs and specialized agencies. UN Women looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. Yes, okay, equality. What does this mean in that context? So it's engaging. It has triggered responses by various different fora and contexts that I think is transformational. I just want to also say that one of the difficulties that Indigenous peoples had in this discussion was the first attempt to embrace Indigenous peoples was to classify us in this category called vulnerable groups. Well, clearly, Indigenous peoples are vulnerable groups, but it leads me to the point about indicators. Indigenous peoples didn't want to be lumped together in vulnerable groups. They wanted to be specified and explicitly recognized within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals as Indigenous peoples, and the corresponding need for specific and explicit reference triggered the fact that there is very little disaggregated data about how the Sustainable Development Goals are actually being achieved within Indigenous communities, Indigenous societies, because no basic baseline data on the basis of a distinct identity has been put in place. So we're starting to see some of these specialized agencies and organs of the United Nations trying to tackle this particular question so we can measure through accurate indicators whether or not the Sustainable Development Goals are being achieved within the Indigenous context, and never mind the idea of being a vulnerable group.
Thank you. Ms. Polke, you indicated...
Yeah, I want to also agree that Sustainable Development Goals are absolutely not only environmental. It's a question about the whole globe and all societies. And for example, in Finland at the moment we have made to our annual state budget analyze how sustainable we are with our financial decisions, and it's in the parliament at the moment. So we try to look the whole society. But every time when the targets as SDGs are adopted in global level, it's very high, and it's a long way to national or regional or local level. How to implement them. I understand that every country, as Finland, we have made our own action plans how to do it. But I come only to the Arctic Council, and I am dreaming that perhaps also Arctic Council could implement some concrete commitments what we are as the 8 Arctic states, we are ready to do to implement these SDGs. Perhaps it comes after Beijing, which is this 2020, post-2020 meeting, but anyway, these concrete, measurable actions are needed, because without them we never see what happens to these very fine targets.
Perhaps in 2020, perhaps next year at an Arctic Summit in Helsinki that your president is working on. Can you add a perspective here from your office, so to speak?
On the
from a biodiversity point of view, to what extent are the SDGs productive in creating additional action?
Well, I think there's sort of two sides to this, as we've already talked about. There is somehow an element of people are doing things. The Arctic Council is doing things, CAF is doing things, CMS is doing things. We're all together in our little working groups coming up with new actions and action plans, and then we come back and we go, oh, okay, so how does this fit into the Aichi targets? And it's a mapping exercise. Here you have the targets, and here's what I'm doing, here's what we're doing, here's what the countries are doing, and here's how it fits in. And then the Aichi targets will be gone, and then there'll be the new post-2020 targets, and we'll do another mapping exercise. And so the cynic in me says, well, okay, so we just have to do a new mapping exercise, and then countries have to, develop their own national plans for the new targets. But I also hear that, there's a real plan this time, that we've learned a lot of things after the Aichi targets were developed in 2010, and, in CMS, the Secretariat and countries were deeply involved in the process, and we are again now, our CMS parties are already getting together on a sort of how to strategize for the post-2020, and they're meeting in 2 weeks in Bonn even on the subject. But I guess my wish is that there really is something more transformational, and as Martha says, if it's bringing together, more sectors of the economy, so that really the change is transformational now, rather than just being the same thing somehow repackaged. So that would be my wish, that something really important comes out of this.
Thanks very much. And let's try to bring it really close to home and say, into this process, how can the scientist, how can the circumpolar action be instrumental in this process? How can CAF help? How can the scientists do more to speed the process up, to increase action, to incite the decision makers even more? Mr. Shestakov.
I would like to highlight 2 points there for 2020 and post-2020. For 2020, we still have 2 years. Seems not much, but still 2 years. So with all those discussions, what happened next, and will be after 2020. So we probably need to spend more time next 2 years actually try to achieve what we can. And many parties, they made their commitments. And what's also important, not only parties, there are some other stakeholders who made certain commitments toward 2020. So the focus...
Who would that be? Sorry.
That can be different other, for example, UN system organization. That can be some businesses. That can be some NGOs. So there is actually a wide range of stakeholders working on biodiversity who also made certain commitments from their side. And that needs to be a focus within the next 2 years, try to achieve as much as possible and report back at the meeting in Beijing.
How do scientists contribute to that?
Scientists in Arctic, which is definitely underrepresented within, say, for example, the Biodiversity Convention, although some years ago we had the specific discussion on Arctic issues under umbrella of new and emerging issues, which is an element of convention discussion. And I can see in the audience a couple of my bosses, the members of the subsidiary body on scientific, technological, and technical advice of the convention, who knows those issues very well. So those, how community can help? Several ways. Convention has a system, for example, of different assessments. And the major assessment, we call it GBO, which is actually stands for Global Biodiversity Outlook. And in 2020, we will publish the 5th edition. The 4th edition benefited from contribution of CAF. And by the way, there is a MOU between Memorandum of Understanding, between Working Group on Conservation of Arctic Fauna and Flora and Convention on Biological Diversity. So for streamlining actually the bringing Arctic issues into convention. And Arctic Council contributed with information based on Arctic biodiversity assessment to the Global Biodiversity Outlook. So that's one avenue. Second avenue, we have very little of case studies, best practices from the Arctic to be presented through side events at our major meetings, whether it's a meeting of our subsidiary bodies, technical or political, or it's a conference of the parties.
So is this an invitation?
This is, that's already late to be an invitation because our conference of the parties will be in a month in Egypt, but unfortunately the door for applying for side events is closed. But of course, for the future, we very much invite Arctic community to be part of it. I think that CAF and government of Finland will do some side events there, and CAF was doing it before. And we definitely encourage further to share this information, including through the national clearinghouse mechanism. And 7 Arctic states are parties to the convention, and all of them, they have the national clearinghouse mechanism, the main information sharing mechanism. So the third avenue, which is also very important, is national reports. Every several years, all parties supposed to submit national report to the convention. And the next one is due mid-December this year. How Arctic is reflected there. How 7 Arctic states actually showed what they did in the Arctic in terms of biodiversity in their national report. That's a big question. And another avenue, national strategies and action plans for biodiversity, so-called NBSUBs. That's another question, how those national plans are incorporating Arctic biodiversity. Is there a special part there or no? What is the reporting against implementation of those plans? How Arctic biodiversity, action for Arctic biodiversity plan based on Arctic biodiversity assessment is actually contributing or not contributing to those national plans. And the last, it's not the last, I can actually continue. The last one I like to address is indicators. Indicators which comes back to back with baselines and of course with monitoring systems. That's where we need science, including Arctic science, to help us to understand those indicators for biodiversity, to help us with baselines, and to help us with the monitoring instruments. And for example, yesterday discussion we had on circumpolar biodiversity monitoring program of CAF. So that's one of the perfect example which can actually contribute to the convention significantly.
Excellent. Thank you for being so instrumental. And Ms. Rojas, I was wondering if you could add to this. How can science and the individual scientists basically do more to achieve what we're all talking about?
Yeah, sure. Yes, let me, in order to respond to that, I wanted to just share with you one thought, again, in terms of seeing nature within the context of the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Agenda, because I think that we have also an important opportunity to show that conserving wetlands, conserving the Arctic is not only for biodiversity, but for what people care. And we haven't talked about climate change. Let me just give you an example. So we always think about, like carbon capturing, we think forests. Well, wetlands actually store a lot more carbon than forests. So peatlands, and the Arctic is full of peatlands. Listen to this, 3% of the land. They store twice as much carbon than all the forests in the world. So what does it mean? It means that when we conserve the Arctic ecosystems, we are also conserving the carbon that otherwise would be emitted. And this is a win-win to the countries. And let me give you an example. The Nordic and Baltic countries, they got together and they saw that they have lost around 50% of the peatlands, and this means 25% of emissions, of their emissions, come from that. So if you conserve wetlands and the Arctic ecosystems, you are also meeting your targets under the Paris Agreement. So why do I say that before coming to CAF? Is that we, as a community of conservation people, talk a lot about ourselves, among ourselves. And we have here a responsibility also to show that when we conserve nature, we are contributing to climate change, to water scarcity, to development needs, and we need more research that shows that. So CAF, actually, I can share not what needs to be done, but what is being done, which is very relevant. So we have this collaboration since 2012 between CAF and the Ramsar Convention, and there is one initiative that is taking place just now under the leadership of Sweden with the engagement of all the members of the Arctic Council, which is to address a main problem. We don't know sufficiently about the wetlands of the Arctic. So I said, like 60% of the Arctic is wetlands. We don't know much. So through this initiative, we are learning what is the status of knowledge about wetlands in the Arctic. There are gaps, so this should be a priority for CAF. The other thing is how to link that with resilience, economic benefits, socioeconomic benefits, and climate change. So the second phase is going to be to look at best practice. Where do we have good examples of how to show this relationship so that we can then scale it up? And a very interesting feature also there is that traditional knowledge is part of that initiative. So we have the participation of indigenous communities and the representatives in the Arctic Council in this initiative, so that we are looking not only at science from a Western perspective, but also science from traditional knowledge and indigenous communities' experience and knowledge of the Arctic. So this is a good example, of what CAF can do. It's a good example also, and let me just finish on that, is how can we build more coherence between efforts? So all of us, we are doing reporting and indicators. We need to look at where is it that we can add value and really make a difference. And it is through reporting towards the SDGs, And for wetlands, we managed to become co-custodians of one of these indicators on wetland extent, so that all these efforts that you are doing should be helping the countries to report so that we have the best possible information, and then being able to know what is the status of wetlands in the Arctic, how they are contributing to peoples and society, and that we can keep track so that we can reverse the trend, which is now that we are losing them.
Thank you very much, also for being such a treasure house of wonderful figures, and for bringing us somewhat linkages to yesterday's discussion of localizing our science and the need to do that more. Thank you very much for that. I want to jump to something that I'm going to share a secret between us with the audience. We had a private conversation just before this session. And you told me, I asked you...
Don't tell everything.
No, I won't. But I asked you, I was preparing you for the question, how can CAF contribute?
He has not yet done any question which he promised.
Yeah, I have. And I asked you, what can CAF do, what can science do? And you answered in 3 words, make it simple. Can you elaborate a little on that?
Yes. So, CAF and you scientists, you are doing very wonderful work. So I have nothing to say about that keep studying. On the other hand, when I am listening you, and that's the point, I'm listening you are talking about very complicated matters in a very complicated way. And that's the reason that I say that keep it simple. Try to popularize what you are saying, because then the decision, it's much more easier to decision makers and also to us civil servants to put it in real life, so implement what you are saying. And I am not going to these all words and how do you say ABA, SDG, SPD, so on and so on and so on. You must have a secret way to say it, but I think that you can manage it. Keep it simple.
Alex, you raised your hand, please.
Yeah, because it's a very important point. And at this stage of our discussions also about post-2020, we have actually a discussion about the new narrative for biodiversity. And you remember yesterday, Gunbritt told that her mother can't understand what biodiversity means. And that's what we need to change together with scientists. And that's urgent. We can't wait anymore because nobody likes to listen about biodiversity and nobody can actually comprehend it when we are talking to decision makers and to businesses. I see in the room a few people who remember one of the projects on biodiversity in Russia some years ago. There was a special, very thin publications with an interesting title for the series, Biodiversity for Children and Ministers. That actually shows that it's the same audience. And that's an extremely important message to colleagues from science, that the messages coming from science need to be converted into language which is understandable by children and also by ministers. And if not, then unfortunately to expect science-based decision-making process became a much more complicated and difficult. And also the biodiversity itself, we can't give it to communication people. I believe that many of you saw a recently popular graph showing the number of media coverage for climate change and for biodiversity since '92 when both conventions were approved. So the climate change this way, the biodiversity is just going this way without almost any spikes at all. And the people saying we like biodiversity to be the same, we like to be like climate change. And communication people saying first, give us biodiversity 2 degrees. Second, instead of 20 Aichi targets and 20 messages, give us maximum 3. And make it in a language that we can understand it. So that's why, again, the appeal to scientists will be actually thinking about those elements when scientists formulating their results, if they expect that scientific results will be observed by management.
Melanie Virtue, I'm sure you agree at 200% with what Alex just told us.
We're going to steal the title, actually. That's brilliant.
Yeah,
Children and
we will
ministers.
all remember that with the children and the ministers from now on. But can you tell us something else? Something that scientists can do from now on and the next coming 2 years until 2020 or 3, that will help to force implementation and use of the knowledge already in existence. There's an abundance of knowledge out there already in existence, and nobody's acting on it.
Yes, I mean that's a frustration, and we see here this week all the fantastic science that's being done, and in conventions like CMS that are fairly technical, fairly specific. we use a lot of the science, and it's fantastic. And whether it's through CAF or the Arctic Migratory Bird Initiative, I mean, a lot of these findings filter through to us, and that's fantastic. And we have various scientific committees that service, CMS and our African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, that's also involved. And so you're already doing a lot. I mean, that's I think the one thing I want to stress is that you're doing a good job, but every time we meet and every time a new issue is discussed, people always say, oh, we need more data. Oh, we need a baseline. And then we need monitoring. And it always seems like, well, we can't conserve anything until we know, we can't take action because we don't have enough data. So, I mean, collect more data. But I think it's also a question that we all need to answer is how do we sort of fill this gap? Because on the one hand, fantastic research is being done, but on the other hand, by the time we actually focus on, okay, we need to move in this direction, we need more data.
Yeah.
So I think that's a problem, really, that we need to solve.
Yeah.
Dali, what do we do?
Well, what I think is, and it builds on comments that have already been made, is that this issue of coherence and coordination of the existing data and not the move toward more information, more research, more data, but in terms of coherence and coordination of what exists already and the potential for the Arctic Council through some of its working groups to review the Sustainable Development Goals. There are clusters of them. There are some natural clusters that can be put into place, and the possibility of voluntary reporting by the Arctic Council, either all Arctic state members or a cluster of Arctic state members responding and demonstrating how some of these goals are being met, or where we stand at the moment in relation to a cluster of goals. I think about food security, for example, or even this question about Sustainable Development Goal 14 that Alex mentioned, to conserve and sustainably use ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Work has been done in this area already, so there's an opportunity to create a benchmark in terms of achieving this particular element, or in combination, because so much is interrelated and interdependent and indivisible as far as the overall Sustainable Development Goals. But this opportunity for voluntary reporting potentially by the Arctic Council, or at least a number of the Arctic Council member states.
Ms. Rice.
Yes, I mentioned the reporting, and I fully agree. I mean, let's build on what exists and what is more impactful. The SDGs is important. Let's keep it simple. Extend, it's something that has a lot of value. But I wanted to also suggest something here, and it's let's see the experience from climate change, just to follow up on what Alex just said. So why climate change became more popular? It was data. It was the Stern report was a key moment, and this was a very famous economist who wrote what were the economic implications of climate change. And then people outside of our community started to think, well, this matters to us. And I think that this is a challenge for all of us. Let's look at plastics. When people started to think about plastic is when you realized that the microplastic can be in what you eat and what you give to eat to your children, then you start to care. So what is it that we can do for biodiversity, for nature, to show that if we lose it, it's going to affect each of us? Not us, the convinced, but the people outside of our circle who are really those who make the decisions, put the political pressure, and make things become important or not. So I think that there is something here in terms of how to show the value of wetlands, of the Arctic, in terms of what people outside of our community care about. And I think that this is a challenge for scientists, for decision makers, and for all of us.
Yes. I'm going to give the word in a second to Ms. Poca, and I think it's only appropriate that she, as the host in her own city, gets the last word, and we're running on overtime. So I'm going to ask the other four of you if you have an additional comment that you'd like to make at this stage. last chance. Any final comments?
Everybody.
Lali first.
Well, I think that it's also important in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals to remember and recall the 3 pillars that are referred to as far as society, economy, and environment, and the changes that can be made within society, and in my view, at least in society in relation to Indigenous peoples and their rights and their status and their place. As far as economy is concerned, I think that we need to not only look at traditional economies or indigenous economies, but also remember that we should be talking about sustainable and equitable development in the Arctic and elsewhere. So not merely sustainable, but also equitable, meaning equal access to opportunity. And with regard to the environment, and from an indigenous perspective, and I highlighted it yesterday, is that profound relationship that indigenous peoples have to their environment. So I just wanted to recall that these 3 pillars are important in terms of the role for all of us in relation to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
Alex?
So just a small addition to what Marta said. I completely agree with that. And then there is a second component where climate was ahead of us. What everyone individually can do for biodiversity. Solutions. Not constantly talking about, oh, we are losing biodiversity, oh, we are losing biodiversity. People like to know what they can do at individual level to help. And we don't have this answer. And until we have this answer, we can't achieve the same what we achieve for climate. And also, Melanie, for your point of having post-2020 may be different. And you also raised a point that you were trying to align with Aichi targets and map it. So the post-2020 process will be very transparent and open, and will be potentially built on contribution of everyone. Because I like to highlight the current working title of the framework, Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, not CBD framework. It's for everyone, and for everyone having a place and their own role in this framework. If we like in the new framework to have something on wetlands, we are not planning to develop within convention the wetland target. We will come to Marta and ask what's the Ramsar target. Give it to us in. Same for convention on desertification, etc. So that will be hopefully a different process and a different framework with everyone being in, but being in means responsible for delivery on this framework, including businesses, including civil society, including potentially developing the system of national contributions, where we will actually expect some commitments coming not that much probably from national governments because the national biodiversity action plans exist, but actually commitment from other players. We like business to commit, we like civil society to commit, and being responsible to deliver.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ross.
Yes, I wanted to end by saying that this is a really important gathering, I mean, in the context of the wetlands agenda, because as I said, you know, most of the wetlands of the world are here, and a big part of the Arctic is wetlands. They don't have visibility, so it's really important that we make this a priority, that more work is done in terms of knowing them and knowing how to link it with key processes. But I wanted just to finalize on what Sasha just said. I mean, we should not be looking only at how biodiversity wetlands are impacted, but how they are solutions. So wetlands are solutions for water. We cannot have sustainable development without water. We don't have water without wetlands. Wetlands in the Arctic are key for the climate system, are key for development, are key for indigenous peoples. So how can we also change the way that we articulate our narrative and talk about nature, wetlands, and the Arctic as a solution for the world's problems?
Thank you very much. And you get the last word. And thanks once
thank
again
you.
that we are hosted here in your city.
Thank you. Thank you. Very briefly, I agree what Sasha started, that we have got an urgent mission to popularize the word, what does it mean biodiversity, so that children, ministers, and also ordinary people understand what we are saying and what kind of consequences it has if this loss of biodiversity continues as it does now. What happens to agriculture, what happens to pollinators, and so on. But my final word is that it's excellent that Arctic Council has the body with permanent participants, so the indigenous peoples and decision makers and the representatives of indigenous peoples can talk with each other. But if we think widely how to implement SDGs and these targets, I am missing more concrete discussions between Arctic Council and regional and local level, because they practically, people who are in local and regional level, they are implementing these fine targets, and we really must see and listen them how to do it practically. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the audience for being so attentive. Thank you very much. Stay tuned. We will continue with the discussion with a representative of the Arctic Economic Council in just a minute. But thank you very much, first and foremost, to the 5 panelists here on stage. Thank you very much for traveling. Thanks for being here.